The true crime reporter never settles for standing outside the yellow crime scene tape. You knock on doors, dig through records, and cultivate sources to get to the bottom of the story. I'm Robert Riggs, the host and creator of the True Crime Reporter podcast, back with another story from 3 decades of investigative reporting. In this episode, I pulled out my reporter's notebooks. My law enforcement sources opened up their confidential case files. We sat down together to talk. And you can listen in to our journey into darkness. But before you do, be advised that this podcast is for a mature audience and not for the faint of heart. Some episodes may contain profanity and graphic details of violent crimes. To follow True Crime Reporter, text True Crime to 33777. Text True Crime, that's 2 words, True Crime, to 33777. With that said, here we go on another journey into darkness. Texas found itself under siege by violent criminals set free by the state parole board in the 1980s and 90s. In the first episode on True Crime Reporter, we learned that the board freed 85 notorious former death row inmates to relieve prison overcrowding. Texas politicians talked tough on crime, but they did not build new prisons. The prison system teetered on the brink of a shutdown. A federal judge threatened to take it over because of overcrowded conditions. So, to avoid political embarrassment, the parole board threw open the floodgates. They released 56,000 ex-cons alone in 1989. Among them, the Broomstick Killer. He was supposed to die in the electric chair. 3 days after he walked out of prison on parole, women's bodies started showing up and others started disappearing. His killing streak runs 2.5 years. Then, U.S. Marshals pick up the trail of Kenneth Allen McDuff. A modern-day Jack the Ripper snatched a young woman out of a Waco convenience store in the middle of the night. 22-year-old Melissa Northrup, a pregnant mother of 2 children, vanished during her shift on a lonely stretch of Interstate 35. A widespread search for the petite clerk turned up an abandoned 2-door tan 1985 Thunderbird nearby. The car belonged to paroled triple killer Kenneth Allen McDuff. When an FBI agent mentioned McDuff's name in passing, Deputy U.S. Marshal Parnell McNamara stopped dead in his tracks.
So the first time we really started to get on McDuff's trail was when Melissa Northrup disappeared from the Quick Pack where she was working on South I-35. I believe it was March the 1st of 1992, and she just vanished. So we didn't know who had gotten her. So about a week later, we got a helicopter up that belonged to the sheriff's office here. My brother and I were in the helicopter along with a couple other deputy sheriffs, and we were flying all around just trying to find some kind of clue. Then, on about the 5th or 6th day, Mike, my brother, who was a deputy U.S. Marshal also, and Bill Johnston, the U.S. attorney here, were walking down the sidewalk going to lunch, and we were approached by an FBI agent stationed here in Waco, Freddie Vela, and he said, "Hey, let me ask you something. Does the name Kenneth McDuff mean anything to you?" And I said, "Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely, a triple murderer." I said, "Why are you asking me this?" He said, "Well, his car has just shown up on the parking lot of the new road in on South I-35 right next to the Quick Pack.
Where
Melissa Northrup had disappeared the same day." I said, "You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes or Dick Tracy to solve this case." I said, "You have a dead girl in the alley and you got Jack the Ripper down at the end of the alley with a knife in his hand. That's a pretty good place to start." So At that point, all three of us said, my gosh, McDuff is the one doing all this, because there was several girls that were missing.
The Marshals knew 46-year-old Kenneth Allen McDuff as the Broomstick Killer. In the last episode, I explained how McDuff dodged his sentence to die in the electric chair. The parole board set McDuff and 84 other convicted capital murderers free in order to relieve prison overcrowding in Texas. Back in August of 1966, McDuff and an accomplice named Roy Dale Green abducted and murdered 3 teenagers in Fort Worth. Author Gary Laverne says McDuff's accomplices provided him with an audience for his violent performances.
Both of these unfortunate, and I've gotten into trouble for saying this, because, you're not supposed to use the word stupid, but both of those men suffered from what I call, in my book, heartbreaking stupidity. And I've gotten into trouble for even saying that. But that I couldn't kid myself anymore. That's what was going on. And McDuff understood that. I mean, it's not like McDuff picked out a high school graduate to bring along. I mean, he wanted to impress people with his brutality, and anyone with an ounce of intelligence or education would not have been impressed.
Armed with a .38 caliber revolver, McDuff surprised Robert Brand and his cousin Marcus Dunham while they were talking with Edna Sullivan, a popular high school junior. McDuff ordered the teenage boys at gunpoint into the trunk of their car. The boys begged for their lives. McDuff shot Robert Brand in the ear and forehead. Mark Dunham tried to shield himself. McDuff shot him through the arm, then grabbed the boy by the hair, put the muzzle of his pistol against Mark's head, and coolly squeezed off a round. Next, McDuff raped the young woman several times, sexually assaulted her with a jagged broomstick, then choked her to death with a broomstick. Thus, McDuff's moniker, the Broomstick Killer. McDuff was no stranger to crime. The 19-year-old had already been to prison for 13 counts of burglary and theft. He had been out of prison for 8 months on parole when he murdered the 3 teens. Parnell McNamara, now the sheriff of McLennan County, and Larry Pamplin, the former sheriff of Falls County, knew McDuff better than anyone in law enforcement. We sat down together to talk about the Broomstick Killer. What was your history? Your father had a history in this. Well, tell us about, your father was originally involved in capturing him.
Well, my father was a deputy U.S. Marshal here in Waco from 1942 up through 1978. So he worked very closely with Sheriff Brady Pamplin of Falls County, our neighboring county. In fact, the first probably 10 to 12 years of my dad's career with U.S. Marshals, all of the federal prisoners were kept in the Falls County Jail because the McLennan County Jail was not federally approved. So as a young boy, and I'm talking about very young, 4 or 5 years old, I would ride with my father to Marlin when he would transport prisoners. And that's where I met Larry and Brady Miles Pamplin when they were very young, about my same age. And so we'd play together when we go down there. My father and Brady worked very closely together, and there was a respect there that was just incredible. It was unbelievable between those two tough lawmen, a sheriff and a U.S. Marshal. And so I first heard of McDuff in 1966 when he killed those 3 teenagers in Everman above Fort Worth. And I can remember being with my father because starting in 1963, January of 63, my father got an okay from the Justice Department to use my brother and me as federal guards. So we were going with my dad to make arrests, transport prisoners to and from the court, off to Leavenworth Penitentiary, El Reno, all over the place. And this happened in 1966 when I was a sophomore at Baylor. My dad and I were in Marlin for something, transporting a prisoner down there, and I remember Sheriff Pamplin talking to my father about this brutal murder that had just happened, that this guy named McDuff, once you hear that name associated with a murder, you don't forget McDuff.
And he already had a reputation.
He had a reputation as just being a lowlife thug and a punk. So I remember Brady Pamplin's hands shaking and his voice trembling when he was telling my father how McDuff had killed these 3 teenagers, and especially the little girl, and putting a broomstick across her throat after he had used it on her and brutally sexually assaulted her and had her down on her back in a gravel road. And I remember the sheriff shaking and saying, "TP, he broke her neck just like you would kill a possum." And I remember how sick I was, and my father, his reaction, I know that either one of those men would have killed McDuff at the drop of a hat, and so would I. I was a guard. I didn't have a badge. I didn't have credentials, but I had a gun. And, to hear something like that happen in such a brutal way, it just made me sick. And I never forgot it.
And then he shows up, and there's a gunfight or a standoff.
Exactly. The night after the brutal murders, McDuff comes back home the night of the murders, but the next night he has a date with a young girl that lived in Bremond.
Seems unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Triple murder, and he's out on a date.
And he's out on this date like nothing ever happened. So at that point, Sheriff Pamplin had been made aware that a cohort named Roy Dale Green had been with McDuff when these murders happened the day before. And as well as I remember, Green and another individual and a young girl that the other guy had a date with were in a car, and it came over the radio that this young girl and these 2 young boys had been murdered up by Fort Worth. Apparently, Roy Dale Green got very upset and may have started crying, and the friend of his that was in the car with him slapped him to get him to come to his senses and say, "What are you talking about?" And he broke down and said, "I was with Kenneth McDuff when he killed those kids." So they went straight to the Falls County Sheriff's Office, to Sheriff Pamplin. And then Sheriff Pamplin got in touch with Sonny Elliott, Sheriff of Robertson County, which is where Bremond is. And so they proceeded along with Sheriff Pamplin's son, Larry Pamplin, who happened to be in town at the time, who was a college student in 1966, like I was.
Mm-hmm. Who's here with us today.
He is here with us today. He sure is. And he can fill in the details of that day better than I can, or that night.
My name is Larry Pamplin.
Larry Pamplin vividly remembers a running gun battle with Kenneth McDuff. They found McDuff driving around with his date in the car. Pamplin's father, the sheriff of Falls County, emptied his shotgun into the car's radiator so he would not hit the young woman inside. The engine overheated and McDuff bailed out. He jumped into a pickup driven by his date's brother. The chase resumed.
I was able to get right up beside of him. My dad had reloaded and jacked another one in the 12 gauge, and he was fixing to take care of the business. At that point in time, the brother slammed on the brakes. Truck slid to a stop, door flew open, and McDuff was on the passenger side, and he just flew out onto the pavement face down.
The Pamplins captured McDuff. McDuff and his accomplice were placed in solitary confinement at the Tarrant County Jail because inmates, outraged by the brutality of the murders, threatened to kill the pair. In November of 1966, the ex-con, now 20 years old, went on trial for capital murder. Prosecutors described McDuff as a cold-blooded, sexually deranged killer. Spectators packed the Fort Worth courtroom. His accomplice, 18-year-old Roy Dale Green, a skinny, emaciated high school dropout, testified against McDuff for 5 hours. Green described how McDuff pressed a jagged broomstick across the 16-year-old woman's throat and choked her to death. Green admitted that he held down her legs to stop her from kicking, and he said they threw her body into a clump of scrub brush. In a written statement, Green said McDuff told him afterwards that he had raped and killed before. McDuff boldly took the stand in a bizarre attempt to blame his accomplice. McDuff claimed that Green dropped him off at a burned-out shopping center where he spent the night. Green, he said, left to find a girl. McDuff's mother, Addie, and sisters watched his testimony from the front row of the courtroom. The jury of 9 men and 3 women deliberated for 4 hours. They sentenced McDuff to die in the electric chair. The convicted triple killer spent 6 years on death row. In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the death penalty as unconstitutional. McDuff's death sentence, along with 129 other capital murderers in Texas, was commuted to life. Then, the parole board secretly released 85 former death row inmates to relieve prison overcrowding. In 1989, McDuff walked out of prison after receiving parole under very suspicious circumstances. That's when Sheriff Larry Pamplin picked up the phone to warn Marshal Parnell McNamara and made an ominous prediction.
And I told Parnell, I said, "You're not going to believe this. This is just crazy." I said, "But I've just received information that Kenneth Allen McDuff has been released from TDC." And I said, "Mark my word." I said, "I don't know if it'll be 3 days, 3 weeks, or 3 months, but I promise you bodies are fixing to start showing up." And I think it was 3 days later.
McDuff's release alarmed McNamara. He found out the ex-con was enrolled in a trade school class right there in Waco.
We were just in a state of disbelief, and I immediately went to the Texas State Technical College Police Department and told them, I said, "You've got a triple murderer going to school here." And then the sheriff told me that he found out that McDuff was attending college on a state grant. So we were paying for this scumbag piece of trash to go to school, you know, and that was more salt in the wound.
But he really wasn't going to school. We later found
he wasn't
never going to class.
He was cutting class, and he was killing people as we were looking at him. And so we were looking at him very hard, and but really didn't have anything to go on. There were girls that were disappearing, prostitutes, and you know, we were concerned about them because, as we've said before, you know, every prostitute was at some point someone's little girl. They weren't always a prostitute, and they didn't deserve to die like this.
True to Sheriff Pamplin's prediction, the body of Seraphia Parker turned up near the trade school 3 days after McDuff got out of prison. The petite woman, a sex worker, had been raped, beaten, and strangled to death. Parker was last seen alive with McDuff in his pickup the day before her body was recovered. It was the same day McDuff reported to his parole officer for the first time since his release from prison on parole.
He was so brutal and so heartless and soulless that the more we got into the investigation and we knew what he had done to those young kids in 1966, his brutality was just over the top. He thoroughly enjoyed inflicting pain and misery and terror on his victims.
Next on True Crime Reporter, the Marshals and U.S. Attorney Bill Johnston form a three-man posse to hunt down Kenneth Allen McDuff.
We warned him off the street because Mike and Parnell convinced me that if McDuff was out, he's killing. I didn't understand the nature of a serial killer like he was. I was learning, but they convinced me that, you know, he is going to be abducting and killing girls. He's a horrible predator.
Aren't you glad it's not a crime to love reality TV? Hey, true crime lovers, this is Shannon, one of the researchers for this podcast. Paper Chaser Paper Goods is your go-to spot for all of your reality TV obsessions. Check out paperchaserpaper.com and channel your love of the Real Housewives with Paper Chaser's reality TV-themed gifts. From cocktail napkins to Bravo TV-themed invitations, Paper Chaser has everything you need to host happy hour at your place and be the it girl of your inner circle. Now remember, it's not a crime to love reality TV. Paper Chaser believes life's a party, so celebrate something every day. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram for the latest Paper Chaser and reality TV scoop. We'll see you on paperchaserpaper.com.
True Crime Reporter is a trademarked and copyrighted news show. It is an original co-production with Podcast Ad Reps. Hosted and written by me, Robert Riggs. Executive producer Elizabeth Arnold. Audio production by Matt Stoker. Original music by Blair King. Associate producer Siler Burr. Social media producer Grace Woodward. Publicity Tim Livingston, PR. Photography Igor Kurgulatz. Graphics Brian David Kerr Designs. Special thanks to Gary Laverne, author of Bad Boy from Rosebud, The Murderous Life of Kenneth Allen McDuff. The audio recordings of the Senate Criminal Justice Committee hearings are courtesy of the Texas State Archives. Archive sound bites included in the episodes are from my original Reporter's Notebook tape recordings. And for our listeners who stayed to hear the credits, here's a little bonus.
So One-Eyed Jack was, as he affirmed in response to being called this, he was a big fat gutter slug, tattooed from head to toe, and was a sort of wannabe biker, but he was a professional, they call them brass pickers. He lived near Fort Hood, Texas, and he would go out onto the range and steal everything he could get his hands on. Spent ammunition, jeeps, pieces of tanks, and he would take it to a salvage yard and get paid for it. And he was blown up in this process on some undischarged ammunition, and it put his eye out. That's his term, One-Eyed Jack. But he was a nasty, crazy-looking guy, but strangely, he had a spark of a conscience. And when we started carrying him back from Dallas in Bigfoot, he said to Parnell, I know you didn't come all this way and do all this just because I walked off from that halfway house. And we said, no, it's about Austin. So he began telling the stories of McDuff in Austin, but importantly put us in the place and in the time frame of Colleen Reed's abduction.